For years, I had been pushing my friends at the PC OEMs and even my friends at Apple to ship better quality panels in their notebooks. Why don't you ship IPS? Why don't you ship IPS? And the response was always, it's too expensive, most customers don't care, and we need multiple suppliers for it. These days, my job's a lot easier. In the early days of kind of Apple's resurgence, the PC OEMs could simply point to Apple and say, well, they're more expensive than we are. And as a result, we don't have to, ship the same quality of components. Then Apple came out with the iPad. Then Apple came out with a $999 MacBook Air. And it maintained quality across both of those product lines. We now have IPS panels shipping in a $499 computing device. And with the arrival of the MacBook Air with Retina display, we now have an IPS panel for the first time in a MacBook Pro. Now this model, the notebook directly to my left here, is priced at $26.99. It starts at $21.99, but make no mistake, those prices will drop over time. It's been very clear from everything Apple's done over the past several years here that its intent is to bring Retina displays top to bottom in their product line. They're available on a subsidized $200 phone all the way up to the MacBook Pro now. And I wouldn't be surprised if over the next couple of years we start seeing Retina displays at the larger the desktop size in the iMac and stuff like that. It's clearly very committed to it. And this makes my job a lot easier because now I can point to Apple's growth in the growth of Apple's Mac segment. A part of Apple's business that still isn't huge, but it's outgrown the PC industry just dozens of quarters, year after year. So I can point to that and say, look, if you want Apple to have 90% market share, then you don't have to ship good panels. But if you do want to remain competitive, then here is a valid competitor who's making a ton of money, who's actually prioritizing quality of things like trackpads, display panels, so on and so forth. So it actually does make my job a whole lot easier. And as a result, we are seeing the PC OEMs pick up on it. Asus actually just started shipping IPS panels in their ZenBook Primes. Almost all of the killer announcements out of Taiwan, out of Computex just a few weeks ago, were paired with some mention of a good quality IPS display or a high resolution panel. So things are starting to change. And, we do have to thank Apple for that because, again, for so long, people could argue that no one's going to pay for it. No one's doing it. There is not enough supply. It's too expensive. Those arguments no longer hold water. And that brings us to the latest attempt in kind of revolutionizing the display industry. And that is this here. It's the Retina display MacBook Pro. It's got a 15.4-inch panel. 2880 by 1800 is the resolution. So twice the horizontal and twice the vertical resolution of the default 15.4-inch MacBook Pro, which ships with a 1440 by 900 panel. And what really makes this an awesome display isn't just the hardware. The hardware is great. You get great horizontal, great vertical viewing angles. And those things are always thrown out there as nice features, but they actually are nice features in a notebook. Whereas on a tablet, I would say for the single user model, you're generally just looking at it straight on. Maybe you're sharing content with another person on it. With the notebook, it's not unusual to have a couple people crowded around it. And really, that's where the horizontal viewing angles come into play. It's also not unusual, if you do a lot of travel and coach, to have to look at it at a strange vertical view, at a strange vertical angle as well. And you get an appreciable benefit from the Retina display if you do a lot of travel and have to carry around a notebook that's this large that you have to kind of fold a bit, even if the person in front of you hasn't reclined. So all of those aspects, definitely tangible benefits to the Retina display, have nothing to do with resolution either. Apple hasn't touched brightness or color gamut or color reproduction accuracy, but contrast is vastly improved. So in our own tests, we measured about a 50% increase compared to the previous generation matte display, and it'll likely be a bit less compared to the previous generation glossy display. But either way, it's a tremendous increase in contrast ratio. The better contrast ratio, better viewing angles, all of this, these are things that come as a result of the panel. Apple's also done some very interesting things with the construction of the panel. Normally, in an LCD stack, in a glossy LCD panel, you've got a couple layers of glass, a bunch of filters and films and stuff like that in between them, and that makes up your LCD panel itself. Then you've got this external cover glass. And that external cover glass is usually what gives it this kind of seamless, edge-to-edge glass appearance. When you don't have the cover glass, usually you have a bezel that kind of covers all the messy and unattractive edges of the LCD panel. What Apple's actually done with the Retina display is you can tell it's still a glossy display, but it's removed that cover glass. And what you have instead are two different sized glass panels that make up the LCD itself. So this outermost panel actually integrates a bezel, and as a result, gives you that same edge-to-edge glass appearance without the use of a cover glass. Removing that third layer of glass ends up reducing unwanted reflections. It's still a glossy display, and we've got some shots here comparing it to the previous generation glossy panels as well as the previous generation matte panels. And you can see it's definitely not a matte panel, but it is more usable than Apple's kind of traditional glossy displays. So all of that, has nothing to do with resolution. And then you get to the killer. You get to the resolution. 2880 by 1800, that's 5 megapixels. It's 40% more pixels in this 15.4-inch panel than are in Apple's 27-inch Thunderbolt display. We've been living with 2560 by 1600 and 2560 by 1440 panels for so long now. And it's insane that just now in 2012, do we finally have something that offers greater pixel density, greater pixel count, and it's in a notebook. I was really disappointed that for so long the display revolution seemed to be confined to tablets and smartphones, and it's just a welcome, very refreshing sight to have that in a notebook because, for those of us that still do use notebooks quite a bit, it's nice to, kind of have a resolution that's a bit higher than what you can get in a tablet. So what can you do with the extra resolution? Similar to what Apple has done in its smartphones and its tablets, all of the extra pixels are really put to use at just making things look better. So traditionally in the PC space, whenever you had an increase in resolution, it gave you more desktop area, it made everything smaller. The thing is, this is a 15-inch panel, and you don't necessarily want things to get really, really small. And this is where the way Apple handles the Retina display under macOS 10, this is where it's actually really clever. So by default, if you go out and you buy a 15-inch MacBook Pro, you get a 1440 by 900 panel. If you go out and buy the Retina display MacBook Pro, you get 4x the number of pixels. So by default, what Apple does is it simply scales everything up by a factor of 2. So all icons, all widgets, all text are now have 4 times the number of pixels, 4 times the resolution. So in effect, they all look the same size that they would on a normal 15-inch running at 1440 by 900, but they're just sharper, they're crisper, because you now have 4 pixels per pixel that you would on a conventional 15.4-inch panel. So that's kind of interesting. But what about the folks who want more desktop space, right? With the old MacBook Pros, you could pay an extra $100, $150 and get a 1680 by 1050 panel. So Apple takes care of those users as well. And what it does is it offers scaled resolution options. So by default, like I said, the OS X desktop, it's drawn at 2880 by 1800, but everything's 4x the size. You can go into the display properties, and whereas you used to see resolution options, now you have scaling options. So there are 2 scaling options now above the default 1440 by 900, best for Retina display equivalent. These are 1680 by 1050 and 19 by 12. Now what these do is they basically adjust the ratio of what you see on the screen. So let me back up. What these basically do is they give you the effective desktop area of a 15-inch 1680 by 1080, 1050, or 1920 by 1200 panel. But everything's kind of scaled and mapped properly to this display. Now, how does that work? So what Apple actually does is, like I said, by default, they render 2880 by 1800. If you pick 1920 by 1200, for example, a scaled resolution, Apple will actually render the desktop at 2x, both the horizontal and vertical dimensions. So it'll actually super sample it. So at 1920 by 1200, you end up with 3840 by 2400 pixels. That ends up being your desktop. Everything on the desktop ends up getting scaled, again, to be 4x the size. Then Apple actually wrote its own scaling routines to take that resulting 3840 by 2400 desktop and make it fit to the 2880 by 1800 panel. That may all sound really complicated, but what it does is effectively gives you a desktop that looks like a 1920 by 1200 15-inch panel, but it kind of fits on the display, and it looks great. Ideally, the best option is if you have some sort of integer mapping to the number of pixels you have on the screen. So the default 1440 by 900 lookalike is going to give you the crispest picture. But the 1680 and the 1920 options both look better than a traditional MacBook Pro. They don't look quite as good as that, kind of best for Retina display setting. But if you need that extra desktop space, they provide it. Now, where things get really interesting, however, are when applications take advantage of what the Retina display can do. So I mentioned that by default, everything on the screen gets upscaled by a factor of 4x, or 2x in each dimension. So that's actually customizable on a per element basis. So for example, if you're an app developer and you've got one window that has a bunch of text in it that you want legible, you might scale that up by 2x. And let's say you've got another window that has an image in it that you don't really need to make any bigger and you want to get 1-to-1 pixel mapping, you can actually leave that at a 1x scale factor. What this allows you to do is, if you look at applications like iPhoto, iMovie, all of the iLife apps, as well as Final Cut Pro, Aperture, and a couple others that Apple's done here, is these Retina-aware apps actually do exactly what I've described. So if you take iPhoto, for example, or Aperture is a great example. It's a professional level video photo editing app. Here, the screenshot you're looking at right now is, I have the desktop set to 1440 by 900, this, best for Retina setting. We're actually drawing 2880 by 1800, but everything looks the way it would on a 1440 by 900. All of the text, all of the menus, all of that stuff, totally legible. Right? It's appropriate sized, no issues there. Now, if you look at that image, that's a 2880 by 1800 screenshot of Diablo 3. And it's actually almost able to be viewed at 100% without scrolling around. The reason is that Apple has done exactly what I've described here. The text gets scaled up, but the image remains 1-to-1. So the image is treated as if, we do have a 2880 by 1800 panel, which we do, whereas the text appears the way it would as a 1440 by 900. This is effectively resolution independence. For the things that need all of the extra space, you get it. For the things that don't and just need to be really sharp, things like text, menus, stuff like that, you get that too. It's the best of both worlds. Now, this does require software awareness. So Apple, and this is really where Apple's role as both a software developer and a hardware manufacturer really benefits it. So OS X out of the box supports it. Like I said, all of the iLife apps support it. Final Cut Pro 10, Aperture, these have all been updated to support it. But if you look at any application that calls Apple's text rendering APIs and kind of does things the by the book way, all of those apps will benefit as well. Text will just look sharp. Images will look sharp. App developers can, if they want to, supply higher res images to make them look even better, but it's not necessary. So if you kind of follow the rules, everything just looks great out of the box. The reality is most of the apps today don't follow the rules. They do some of their own kind of off-screen buffer rendering, even if they do call Apple's own text rendering APIs. Long story short, certain apps will look like, if you look at Chrome here versus Safari, you see blurrier text. Google has to update Chrome to kind of be Retina aware. If you look at Photoshop CS6, even though Apple showed off Photoshop CS6 at its WWDC keynote, the current publicly available version of it isn't Retina aware, and you get the same kind of suboptimal use of the display. Now, I expect all of this to change. It's such a compelling feature, and the Mac platform has grown so much in recent history that I can't see software developers, maybe Microsoft's going to drag its feet on it, but I can't see them not wanting to kind of enable support here. But there is going to be that kind of growth curve. There are other issues, right? So even if you look at Apple's first-party apps, things like Safari, for example, in all of these modes, even at its default mode, you're drawing 4x the number of pixels on the screen compared to, kind of a stock 15-inch MacBook Pro. And the hardware in this, I'll get into that in a second, the hardware in this is fast, but it's still not ready for a 4x increase in screen resolution. Now, one issue that you'll see today under Lion is if you go through and you scroll around in Safari on certain web pages, even at the default 2880 by 1800, 1440 by 900 lookalike setting, you'll see some choppy scrolling depending on the website. And the reason for that is that Safari, even today, a number of the actual things that go on in the background that allow scrolling to happen, a number of those tasks are still handled on the CPU. Mountain Lion kind of addresses this. Mountain Lion leverages core animation. You get a lot more GPU-based rendering in applications like Safari. The overall experience in Mountain Lion is a lot better, but that's still a month away. So today you kind of are in that situation where, look, Apple's shipping the best CPU they can in here. This is an Intel quad-core Ivy Bridge that's in it. But even that isn't really designed to do some of the stuff that's going on right now. So that's something you definitely have to be aware of. And if you want that kind of polished Apple out-of-the-box experience from day one, you might as well wait a month for Mountain Lion to hit. Now, of course, everyone who buys one of these today gets a free upgrade to Mountain Lion. So, there is hope that something, much better is coming sooner. But even Mountain Lion doesn't completely solve it. If you look at certain tasks, JPEG decoding, for example, that's still handled on the CPU. One of the biggest, pain points for this right now is just you open up Facebook and you scroll down your news feed. Even under Mountain Lion, that's not going to happen at 30 or 60 frames per second, whereas it could on the previous generation MacBook Pro. And there's really not much you can do about it. That's just, we're limited by the software and we're limited by the hardware. And that's something that you definitely want to keep in mind. Speaking of hardware, let's get to what's inside of this thing. So I mentioned before, Intel's 22 nanometer Ivy Bridge. There's only a Core i7 that's available. You can choose your clock speed and cache size. There's a 2.3, a 2.6, and a 2.7. The bottom two have 6 megs of L3. The top one has 8 megs of L3. All of them have hyperthreading. All of them have AES and I support, VT, X, and D. So, there's no weird feature binning going on here. It's really depending on how much you want to spend. The default configuration gives you a 2.3 at $21.99. If you go to the $26.99 model, you get the 2.6 and you can upgrade to the 2.7 as well. Honestly, all of these are going to do fine. You're not going to see a huge performance delta between these chips and the Sandy Bridge chips that were used in the last generation MacBook Pros. If you're one of those folks who upgrades year to year, don't expect a tremendous boost on the CPU side. If you're someone who upgrades every 3, 5, 6 years, it's going to be like the fastest thing in the world to you. Where even users of last year's models will see a performance improvement is in the GPU in this thing. So Apple does this thing where, pretty much every other generation they switch GPU vendors. And this time they've, again, gone back to NVIDIA. So you've got Mobile Kepler inside here. It's GK107. This is the GeForce GT 650M, 384 cores. Core clock at 900 megahertz, using 128-bit GDDR5. There's a gig of GDDR5 in here. There are no other GPU options. This is all you get. This and of course Ivy Bridge's HD 4000 graphics on board. There's just a ton of memory bandwidth allocated to the GT 650M. So effective data rate is over 5 gigahertz. That translates into over 80 gigs per second of memory bandwidth. The combination of both of these two results in much better performance at higher resolutions. Believe it or not, you can actually run Starcraft 2, Half-Life 2 Episode 2, and Diablo 3 at the panel's native 2880 by 1800 resolution, and they're all playable. Starcraft and Diablo 3, I wouldn't say are necessarily smooth, but they're playable. The other killer thing is if you do have a 27-inch display, 2560 by 1440, if you hook this up to it, you actually do get playable frame rates at that resolution. It's like I said, this is 40% more pixels at the on-screen res. So backing off a bit and going to that external display actually does help things a bit. So that really covers the silicon inside. There's Intel 7 series chipset, which brings us USB 3. There are 2 USB 3 ports on here. Obviously, this thing's got Thunderbolt. So the predecessor, the 2011 MacBook Pros, had a single Thunderbolt port driven off of a controller that was only really available to Apple. Now we got Cactus Ridge, and we got a four-channel version driving 2 ports. So each Thunderbolt port can drive a single DisplayPort display, or Thunderbolt display, whatever, as well as a chain of Thunderbolt devices. So that's 2 displays, supported directly off to the Thunderbolt ports, plus the third, which will be the Retina display, and that's the official Apple supported configuration. There's also an HDMI port on the other side of the device, and you can actually use that in tandem to drive 4 displays. It's not an officially supported configuration, probably not ideal given just the amount of video memory you'd need to drive all of that and the amount of GPU horsepower you need to drive all those pixels smoothly, but you can physically do it in a pinch. So getting back to Thunderbolt, we've got 2 ports. Even with Cactus Ridge, each port is good for roughly 900 megs per second in addition to driving DisplayPort video. But the thing is, you can drive 2 of them now. So in our test, we found I hit just under 1400 megabytes per second. Fairly confident I could bring it up to close to 1800 if I had 2 Promise Pegasus chassis with a bunch of SSDs in them. Either way you look at it, tons of really high performance sequential I/O for storing movies, photos, stuff like that, out of your system. And that's kind of necessary with this generation. So Apple has significantly reduced the volume of the chassis. It's a uniform thickness, just over 0.7 inches. It's actually thinner than the 13-inch MacBook Air's thickest point, but it's not a tapered design, so it's overall it's obviously thicker. It's over 4.5 pounds, but it's significantly lighter than the previous generation 15-inch MacBook Pro. I would say just as tangible as the display improvements are the improvements in the chassis itself. It's still a unibody design, but it's so much thinner, it's so much lighter. I have to lug a 15-inch MacBook Pro around whenever I travel pretty much. It's basically my desktop. It's got everything in it. It has the horsepower I need to do what I do when I'm traveling. So if you're like me and you have to carry one of these things around, the improvements in just chassis alone are worth the upgrade. In getting that thin, Apple made a couple of sacrifices, and these are big ones. One, there's no optical drive. A lot of folks have already kind of abandoned that idea to begin with. 2, there's no user replaceable memory. So all the memory on here, like on a MacBook Air, is soldered onto the board. The concession from Apple is they give you 8 gigs of DDR3L, the lower voltage DDR3, lower power, what have you. They give you 8 gigs of that standard. And to be honest, for most usage models, that'll last you likely for the lifetime of the machine. Assuming you don't keep the machine for like 10 years. The other thing about memory is you're more likely to kind of run into processor bottlenecks, GPU bottlenecks, before you'll run out of system memory. Now, there is obviously the exception. A lot of folks who do a lot of video editing, who have workloads and usage models today that demand 8 gigs or more. What do? So Apple offers a 16 gig kind of build to order option. But again, it's all soldered down. So you have to make that decision up front, day 0, when you spec the machine. And that's going to be a sticking point for a number of users. Storage is somewhat similar. Whereas the old MacBook Pro had a 2.5-inch hard drive bay, and you could swap out the optical drive if you wanted to and kind of stick another SSD in there. All that's gone. You get a custom PCB. It is removable. It's a custom PCB with a custom Apple connector on it. It's SATA somewhere in there, but it's it's Apple's own design. So you get that with basically an SSD controller, DRAM cache, and NAND on board, and that's your storage. The default $21.99 configuration comes with 256 gigs of flash storage. The $26.99 model gives you 512, and that upgrade, that's the only way to get more storage. So if you need more than 256 gigs in this machine by default, you have to buy the $26.99 model. Now, Apple even offers a 768 gigabyte version as well, if you kind of need even more. But your hands are tied. That's the best you can do. As a result, it's still livable because you do have Thunderbolt, right? And that's where Thunderbolt and all of this really, really gains importance in this type of machine, because you are going to have to rely on Thunderbolt for all of your mass storage of movies, large image files, stuff like that. And the flexibility of having 2 Thunderbolts here is important because other things are gone. Gigabit Ethernet is gone from the chassis itself. There's no Gig E port. There's no FireWire 800. You have to rely on external sources to drive all of that. Now, again, as a concession here, Apple's offered a Thunderbolt to Gigabit Ethernet adapter for $30. And to be honest, that gets the job done. The thinking is that you would only really use Gigi when you're at your desk, and when you're at your desk, you're likely connected to some sort of a Thunderbolt display, or you can just plug in this dongle. Whereas on the road, you'll likely be using Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi in the machine is still the 802.11n 3x3 with 3 spatial streams. Basically, a very, very similar setup to what we had in the previous generation MacBook Pro. And that's kind of the only really disappointing thing on the connectivity side. We're really hoping for 802.11ac. It's pretty much guaranteed that we'll see that with the Haswell upgrade to this next year. But, for those of you who've been holding out for that's something to be aware of. So again, the storage is something that you do have to pay attention to. I'm sure we'll see third-party SSD upgrades going forward. The thing is, this generation, Apple actually picked the best SSD controller for use under OS X, in my opinion. Samsung's PM830, which is the same controller that's used it's the OEM version of what's used in the Samsung SSD 830, which, because of Samsung's relationship with Apple, its default firmware is very, very good and very, very well behaved under OS X. So even if third-party guys come out with solutions that'll fit in here, that kind of clones Apple's custom connector and custom PCB form factor, it's not likely that there'll be an upgrade in terms of controller technology. So that's something to be aware of. I think there's been a lot of debate over what Apple has done with the Retina display MacBook Pro in that it's made it a very unupgradable, very, very appliance-like machine. And I'd have to agree there, but at the same time, we've already given up on upgrading a lot of things when we've gone to, these smaller form factor notebooks. Coming from the desktop space, you already give up on upgrading CPU and GPU. Those are gone. So you look at what more do you lose as you go to the Retina MacBook Pro. You do lose an easily serviceable panel. Like I said, no cover glass, so if something happens to it, you're going to have to replace that entire module. The concession there is Apple's usually very, very good about replacing things. It's not an official policy, but they're usually good about replacing things for customers kind of free the first time. I know I've had a lot of success with that, as well as other folks that I know. But again, it's not an official policy. You can't really rely on that. So the display is a sticking point. The soldered on DRAM on board, that's an issue. And what I would like to see, Apple is really, in this industry, has pushed component vendors to do things that they hadn't before. And I would love to see Apple use its clout, use its dollars, and use its desire for kind of forward-looking, very portable form factors to go in and promote and push for the creation of interchangeable DRAM, interchangeable solid-state storage that's standardized, that can fit in a chassis that's this big, or that's this thin. I totally accept that the standard 2.5-inch hard drive form factor won't cut it. It reduces volume for things like battery, and it's already fairly cramped in there. And the standard SO DIMMs, I totally get that they won't fit in here either. But I'd love to see Apple's engineers come up with something that can fit, and then take that design, give it to the rest of the world as a look, hey, this is a standardized form factor we're going to do, and let's further drive down commodity pricing on this size DRAM and these types of SSDs or this type of flash storage. I get that it's not in Apple's best interest because it still makes a ton of profit off of the upgrades, but I'd still like to see them do that anyways. Clearly Apple's been extremely successful and they've got the money. It would be a gesture of goodwill to their professional users, in my opinion. It'd be something that I'd love to see happen. Even that being said, if the display doesn't sell you, if the improved thermal characteristics, actually that's one thing I didn't even touch on yet. So one issue anyone who owned the previous generation MacBook Pro had was that, man, those fans ran a lot and the system got very, very hot. You were looking at 32 nanometer Sandy Bridge silicon, nearly 1 billion transistors, plus 40 nanometer AMD GPU silicon, another 700 million transistors there. I mean, it's just a ton, almost 2 billion transistors of very, very high performance switching circuitry in a notebook, in a 15-inch notebook. And that's just unheard of until now, until these past couple of years. You really couldn't even do that kind of stuff. So it was pushing the limits a bit. Things got warm. The CPU never throttled under, at least as far as I could tell, under heavy CPU loads. But in gaming workloads, where you're stressing both the CPU and GPU, we did see throttling of performance over time. The Retina display MacBook Pro almost entirely addresses that. by moving to 22 nanometer on the Ivy Bridge on the CPU side and 28 nanometer with Kepler. And not to mention that Kepler is a very power efficient architecture to begin with. The combination of the two kind of ensures that you don't see throttling on the CPU or GPU side, even in games. Furthermore, Apple's actually gone in and revamped the way they do cooling in it. So in the previous generation chassis, heat exchanging all happened kind of between the display and the base of the chassis. Now there are actually two inlets, one on either side, as well as the traditional kind of heat exchanger at the back there of the main keyboard chassis. The end result is tremendous improvement in cooling performance. The fans will still spin up. If you're firing up a game, if you're doing a heavy CPU workload, you're going to hear the fans. But otherwise, moderate workloads, light workloads, it sounds silent. Even when the fans are spinning at the same 2,000 RPMs that they would in the previous generation chassis, it's quieter. Apple also went to asymmetrically spaced fan blades. They made a big deal out of this and got a lot of attention for it, but hey, it actually does work. Particularly at low RPMs, the thing sounds silent. Especially if you compare it to the previous generation chassis. On its own, in a quiet room, you can definitely hear it. At higher RPMs, it produces a different sound. The idea is if you asymmetrically space fan blades, you create sounds at a multitude of frequencies rather than concentrating them at just one frequency, and that's supposed to make it less noticeable. If you go in expecting it to be dramatically quieter at a full-on 6K plus RPM fan speed, you're going to be disappointed. But it's still pretty good. I think the more noticeable impact is the fact that it is really, really quiet, virtually silent for kind of all light usage. And under load, it just provides a different sound. I wouldn't necessarily say it's significantly quieter, just different. But overall, if you look at the display, if you look at the improvements in chassis size and dimensions and weight, if you look at acoustic improvements, and there are other improvements as well. Apple's done they're better speakers in this thing. Again, you're limited by the size of the chassis, but it does sound better than the previous generation chassis. So there are just a bunch of little tangible improvements like that as well. So if the display doesn't get you, if the portability doesn't get you, if the silicon doesn't get you, just the package as a whole, delivering all of these things, it's the best Mac that Apple's ever built. In the past, Apple's always built really good computers. And they've always had, kind of rough edges here and there. Even this one, it's got issues. Like I said, the software story isn't completely ready yet. You're really going to wait for Mountain Lion for things to get perfect or closer to perfect. And even then, we're still limited by the hardware that's available today. Apple's pushing, they're driving more pixels on this than most desktop GPUs have to drive. And there are inherent limitations associated with that. But considering all of that, even with all of that taken into account, it really is the best Mac Apple's ever built. It's the best display Apple's ever introduced into a system. It's the best display I've ever seen. It's actually one that I appreciate even more than the iPad's Retina display or the iPhone's Retina display. I interact with those and they look great, but I don't interact with them in the same way that I do with my Mac when I'm working. This panel's kind of ruined me for all other panels, notebook and desktop. I almost don't want to hook it up to an external monitor because it just looks that good. And that brings us to the real question of, do you buy it? And I think it's more a question of when, right? Because in a year's time, in pretty much exactly a year's time, there'll be a Haswell upgrade to this that'll drive GPU performance and CPU performance even higher. And then a year from that, you'll get Broadwell. And Broadwell will kind of bring temperatures down again, as well as really, really ramp up GPU performance. And it's a really tough decision to make because for the next 3 generations, there's going to be a lot of really good hardware. And it's really tough to tell you to wait until 2014 because it's such a good machine today. And it's tough to tell you to wait, again, even to next year because it's such a good machine today. So you really have to look at when the last time you upgraded was. I think if you upgraded in the past 2 years, the right thing to do is wait another year and pick up the Haswell version. If you've been holding off on an upgrade since 08, since 09 even maybe, it's very fast. And if you, especially, like I said, if you have to carry this thing around, you will appreciate the benefits that the new chassis brings. So it's really picking that right upgrade price performance curve for yourself. And here's the other kicker. Eventually, this is going to get cheaper. The MacBook Pro starts at $1799, but the Retina display model starts at $2199. If there's anything we've learned from Apple's behavior over the past couple of years here, is that it's no longer just a purveyor of really, really high-end products. Apple wants to have a device at all price points. And at the same time, Apple wants to have a Retina display available at all price points. So I wouldn't be surprised to see the MacBook Air, to see the 13-inch MacBook Pro, to see everything get a Retina display at some point. The question is when. So that's another thing you have to take into account when you're kind of figuring this out. But if you're in the market for a notebook, if you're in the market for a new Mac, I really don't see a better option on the table today. There are more portable options, and if that's what you're looking for, there are those options as well. And that's an entirely other discussion about how good the Haswell version of the MacBook Air is going to be, for example. But if you're in the market for a MacBook Pro, I don't see a better option. I mean it when I say it. I really think it's the best Mac that Apple's ever built. So I'll go through all of this and a whole lot more in our review on the website. So be sure to check that out. And thank you for watching.